80% of the people who took the survey had experienced workplace trauma. Just the shocking number that 80% of people had experienced workplace trauma. It was 56% that had said the words trauma, but when asked definitions of trauma and if they had experienced those things, 80% clicked those boxes that really demonstrated that they had experienced this. One of the other things that we saw was that people would be more reactive to the normal or to the common workplace triggers.
Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. I'm Lori Adams Brown, and this is a podcast for those who are different and want to make a difference. Here's something most leadership books won't tell you. Your team is very likely carrying trauma, and so are you. And if you're not leading with that in mind, you're leaving potential and people on the table. Maybe it's that employee who flinches during feedback sessions because of a former boss who screamed. Maybe it's the colleague who can't seem to trust the team because they've been betrayed before. Or maybe it's that third culture kid who's lived in 6 countries and learned that relationships are temporary. So why invest deeply? Maybe it's you pushing through, performing brilliantly, but also wondering why you feel so disconnected from yourself and everyone around you. Today, I'm sitting down with Elizabeth Vahey Smith, COO of TCK Training and Unstacking Co., certified trauma-informed care practitioner and author of Trauma-Informed Leadership. Elizabeth has spent over a decade researching how trauma shows up in the workplace, conducting surveys with hundreds of respondents, leading trauma debriefs for teams and crises, and here's what it takes to make her not only unique, but helping her do all of it while traveling full-time through 27 countries with her husband and 2 children, is that she really cares deeply about trauma in the workplace and people and how it affects you. Elizabeth isn't here to make you uncomfortable. She's here to make you aware, because whether we're talking about big T trauma, the kind that changes everything in an instant, or little t trauma, the accumulation of difficult experiences that shape how we show up, the reality is trauma-informed leadership isn't just compassionate. It's strategic. It builds psychological safety, unlocks performance, and creates the kinds of teams people actually want to be a part of. So if you're an expat navigating constant transition, at TCK trying to understand why you feel different, a leader who senses something's off with your team but can't exactly name it, or someone who's ever wondered if your past is affecting your present, well, this conversation is for you, because this isn't about being a therapist. I'm certainly not one. It's about being a leader who sees people fully. Let's begin. Hello, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for joining us today here at A World of Difference. I'm really excited for this conversation and to get to know a little bit more about you and your leadership and the things you're putting out into the world. And I really think I want to start off with just getting to know a little bit more about the cultures and the places that have formed you as a person and as a leader. So share a little bit about that with us first.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's so good to be here and be able to share with you and your audience. The cultures, well, I started in America. I was born and raised there. And then we began our cross-cultural journey, and that started in Papua New Guinea. So I took a couple young children out into the jungles of Papua New Guinea. My son learned how to walk there. My daughter was there from 3 months old. And we spent the first 5 years of their life there. And so that was an incredibly formative experience for me to just have such important years of my children's lives be a barefoot in the jungle with bush materials kind of experience. And then in 2020, we shifted out of that role and began traveling the world full time. And so we've been to 27 different countries. And one of the ways that I see the culture of Papua New Guinea really impact and shape us is that when you live in the jungle with jungle resources, the expectation for maybe like luxury of living is really low, and also your ability to solve problems is really high. And so when we travel to other places, we would just kind of roll with the punches. Whatever it was good enough, and we could solve whatever problems we encountered. And so it was a really amazing experience to prepare us for the rest of the world's journeys, because there wasn't a lot of culture shock after that. We did spend about 12 non-consecutive months in Egypt, and so we have that Egyptian experience was so wonderful. And we've just spent 11 months in Vietnam, and so that's where I am currently, and that's been another incredibly different culture, but wonderful to add to this experience of global mobility that we've been privileged to have.
It's so exciting. And, so many listening to this podcast will be able to relate on a certain level just to the different places you're living, maybe not the exact places, but that's just the thing about people who are globally mobile. And this whole, there's actually a whole part of corporations where they have people that lead in global mobility and help people find homes and make sure their things get shipped to the right place and work through the temporary housing. And it's just, whether it's an NGO or a, corporation, there's whole industry around this too, and vendors around it. And for those of us who've done this quite a bit, it sort of becomes normal. And some of the people even working in that industry have never done it themselves. I was recently at a global mobility conference here in San Francisco near the airport. And I wasn't even an expert. I was just invited as one of the attendees. And I realized I've had a lot of experiences, and you have too, just from living in these places where things happen. And there is a certain level of sort of resilience. But at the same time, often experiences in these very diverse places that are so different can, for various reasons, provide trauma. And that can happen in a work environment or just living in a new place, or a disaster like a tsunami or an earthquake. So you have written about trauma-informed leadership, and I'm really curious to know from your perspective, how does trauma impact someone as they're working in their workplace?
Yeah, that's such a fantastic question. And when we talk about trauma, a lot of people have different concepts in their mind. Some people are thinking, okay, trauma, that's a natural disaster, that's a near-death experience, that's some kind of violence. Like, these are big traumas. And we actually call them big T traumas because they do seem really big. And what I have found is that big T traumas, while they can impact the workplace, they are least likely to, actually. Because when you have been through a big T trauma, like a tsunami, for example, there are not a lot of triggers that happen in the workplace that are related to a tsunami. And so that is where we find the least impact is from those big, huge things, generally speaking. Now, where I see a lot more impact is what we call the little T traumas. And these are things that make people feel helpless, make people feel incompetent, like they can't do anything, make people feel like the world is dangerous and danger is around every corner. And they may be small things, but if they impact the brain in that way where the brain learns the world is dangerous and you are helpless, or the world is dangerous and you are helpless, that is going to really impact how someone shows up in the workplace. And what we see then are people who respond out of fear to these little tiny triggers that most people are like, why are you even upset over that? So a fantastic example that a lot of people can empathize with is when your boss says, we need to talk. Now, a lot of people just immediately have that like, oh no, and their anxiety is going up, they are stressed out, their bodies are panicked. And that is because through these little tiny experiences that we've had, we have learned that if somebody says we need to talk, we are in danger. A very bad thing is about to happen. And what that looks like in the workplace is now our boss, whether there was something dangerous or not, and my boss would do this to me all the time, where she would say, we need to talk. And then it was about something that had nothing to do with anything. It was the most benign conversation ever. And my heart is racing the entire time through, trying to get through the benign stuff to the bad part. And luckily I was aware of this. I wasn't being reactive. But sometimes when bosses come with this phrase, people in their fear state get reactive. And they say things that aren't helpful. And it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy as their reactions make the situation worse than it needed to be. And so this is just one of those really prime examples of how our previous experiences and those fears shape and influence how we show up in the workplace. And that leaders can make tiny, tiny pivots that really change the whole nature of the conversation. Because all we have to do is not say, we need to talk.
Yeah, exactly. And I think most people are walking around in offices and workplaces with no idea how there's no way. There's no way we can know, because everybody has this filter that's unique to them, as unique as our fingerprint is what they say. And it's all formed from your personality, your upbringing, the cultures and languages that you've learned, the school teachers you've had, just like a whole data set of experiences that form this filter, including little and big T traumas. So there's no way a manager would know what might be triggering someone. And so I guess the question is, what kind of leadership behaviors actually build that psychological safety for people to be able to push back or question or even say, hey, this isn't working for me. This is happening for me.
Yeah, that's such a great question. There are a number of things that are common workplace triggers. And so learning about these common things can help leaders get ahead. But you're right. Ultimately, there are so many tiny things that no one would have expected to be a trigger that we really have to be very responsive to the team that we actually have. Which is why one of the most powerful tools that leaders can use is to start with a curiosity-led conversation. And these curiosity-led conversations are going to be incredibly powerful for people who have trauma histories. They're also really powerful for people who come from different cultural backgrounds and even neurodiversity. When we begin a conversation by asking to understand more about the other person's perspective in the situation, rather than assume that we as the leader already know all of the answers, even if we think that we do, by starting with the question to confirm what we think that we know, I have found such breakthroughs happen. Because when we start with a question, first, the person that we're talking to feels heard, which is a huge component of psychological safety in the workplace. They are about to be listened to, they can advocate for themselves, and we as the leader are paying attention. But then we often get information that we may not have expected that really shifts the way that we need to be approaching these situations and gives us insight to, oh, the reason that you did this was because you were scared. And you were scared about something that I can speak into and let you know that actually doesn't need to be a concern. Or you were triggered, and so here's how we can avoid those triggers. Or your cultural background made you think that this was what was happening in the subtext. And actually, this is a different cultural context. So let me explain to you the subtext of this situation. And so starting with those curiosity conversations gives an opportunity to enter into the deeper conversation that's actually going to solve the problem that we're experiencing in the workplace.
So helpful. Some cultures are just more low context, others are more high context communication. Some, are very direct communicators and others are more indirect. It could be the United States is a very direct culture. So are the Dutch. And then you have cultures like where you're at in Vietnam or in South, Thailand, very indirect. They're going to triangulate some. They're going to tell the neighbor to tell the neighbor something, or to tell the sister to tell the mom. I mean, because just you don't want to come across directly in a lot of things. But somebody might misunderstand and even experience feeling attacked when, like, a Dutch person might be saying something that, and out of kindness, they want you to know this could be helpful to you. And they say it super directly because they're trying to give you advice or feedback, and it feels like an attack, right? And so some of these things could both be a little kind of trauma triggering from something in the past, but also just mixed with the cross-cultural piece, extremely complex and difficult to navigate. So I guess the question is, how can people tell if that behavior is more of from a trauma or if it's more from a cultural difference?
Yeah, that's a great question. Oftentimes when we see trauma, it is intrinsically connected to anxiety or fear, that kind of elevated response. So when someone is experiencing a cultural difference, often it is, well, this is how we do it here. Oh, you want me to do it this way? Okay, that's new, that's different, this is uncomfortable, but I'll give it a go, right? When we see trauma as part of the conversation and we say, hey, you're doing it this way, I want you to do it this other way, if past experience has told them that other way is dangerous, this isn't just a different thing to do. This is a dangerous thing to do. An example of this is when I ask people to speak up in meetings. When I say, listen, I want to hear your voice. I want for you to be contributing to this conversation. And if it's a cultural difference, then usually they're like, okay, it's weird and awkward, but I'll give it a go. When it's a trauma difference, there is a fear, there is a panic, there is an uncertainty. And it's not as simple as just try something different. They need to overcome their body, which has taught them, based off of their life experience, that this is dangerous. Their body files that information under survival instincts. And just like they will not jump off a cliff, they feel like they can't speak up in a meeting because the dangerous thing is going to happen. And so, although I've also seen this connected to cultures, because sometimes the way that culture teaches lessons can be traumatic. And so I have worked with people who have come out of Asian background and said, hey, I want to hear your voice in a meeting. I want to hear your ideas. And I've had people who are able to make that shift easily, and I've had that people who made that shift very fearfully. And so the next part of the conversation is, when was a time that you felt like you could speak up? How can I reverse engineer those conditions in this workplace so that it's easier for you to be able to meet my expectation here in this workplace? And it's about coming up with creative solutions so that we can say, this is the expectation that I have in this workplace. And I'm not going to shift my expectation. This is the expectation that we have, but how can we empower you creatively to be able to reach that expectation? Those are the conversations that we really want to target.
That's really helpful to understand the differences. And, once again, it's super complex, right? Everybody's so complex and nuanced. When it comes to trauma, that's a word it's a terrible word. It just, even the word itself, some people don't like to talk about it. It even sounds woo-woo to some people, especially in the corporate world. It feels sometimes to people in the United States, sometimes like you're saying things that are just, I don't know, really crunchy and just nonsense, because some people just say, put your head down, do your work. It doesn't matter. Be resilient. And they don't even want to talk about trauma. And yeah, it's a reality for so many people. I guess the question I would like to ask around it, though, is when it comes to trauma, we know the bad parts. It sounds like a bad word and even uncomfortable, but is there anything good that could come out of something like trauma?
Oh yes, absolutely. There's so much that is gained through our life experiences. And ideally, these life experiences would not be traumatic for us. The hope that we could have is that we could go through hard things and we could learn normal life lessons. And that's one of the things that I hear a lot from people who are like, trauma, is why can't it just be a life lesson? And the difference between trauma and a life lesson is that feeling of helplessness that we get and the feeling that the world is dangerous. It's not just a good cautionary tale that this is danger. It is that deep-seated fear that we are helpless in the face of this danger. One of the first good things that can come from trauma is this life lesson that we achieve out of it, is recognizing, okay, that is dangerous. That is difficult. Usually what we get then is perhaps trauma skills, is the second thing that we get out of a trauma, is trauma skills. And these are skills that we needed in order to survive this situation. They may not have been skills that we would have developed in any other context in our life, but we really needed them in order to survive this situation, so we figured out those skills. The thing about trauma skills, as a quick cautionary sidebar, is that trauma skills are intrinsically linked with this trauma. They are used out of fear, out of anxiety, out of a desperation to fix this danger. And they are also really, really great workplace skills. And so we find people come into the workplace and they start using these trauma skills, like managing things in a high-stress situation, or always anticipating the bad thing that can happen and preparing for that ahead of time so that the bad thing doesn't happen. It's these skills of hypervigilance that when they show up, we love them at work. But if we're not careful, our team members are going to be utilizing them and even overutilizing them the whole time their body is essentially in this trauma response. And they have the skill to be able to look like a rock star, but the length of that, their ability to do that before they hit burnout, is quite short. And so we need to be cautious that even as people are doing these excellent things that they're super good at, that they're doing them out of a fullness of who they are as an employee, versus this fearfulness that if they're not doing this, everything is going to fall apart. The other things that we get usually come out of healing from trauma. And in healing and overcoming from trauma, what we learn are the skills of nuance, of being able to see, okay, this situation was dangerous, but the whole world isn't dangerous, and I'm not helpless, and here's this space in between this situation being dangerous and this other post-traumatic wisdom that I was able to learn here. And also the ability to be more empathetic. I was talking to one of my clients, and she said that she went to her leadership. She had a problem. She said, this situation is a problem and I'm having a difficulty with it. And she was about to hit on the solution that she had come up with. And then her leadership said, oh, that's the job. And it felt so helpless. Like it made her feel, what, like there's nothing I can do? Like, is that the context that you're telling me? Is I'm just stuck? And she went on to continue her thought and advocate for the change that she wanted to see. And they were able to roll that out. But through that experience of being shut down so abruptly and made to feel helpless, she realized that's not how I want to lead. I will never say that to one of my employees because I don't want them to experience that level of helplessness that I felt and I didn't need to have felt. So I think we see a lot of ways where the experience and also the overcoming and healing from trauma can empower us and really become a strength for us.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And it's helpful that you talk about it in a workplace context where it can be a bit exploited when people are expected to live in this hypervigilance and work constantly as, making sure no balls drop, and they can give them multiple assignments at once, maybe even two full jobs, right? But as you mentioned, it does lead to burnout, and people's brains really can't do that for a long period of time. In the same way that we would see in international disaster relief, the workers that work in these environments know that they require you to do R&R after, when I worked tsunami relief, all the big global NGOs, it was usually 2 weeks on, and then you had to take a break. You were forced to leave the area because you just were working in hypervigilance. You weren't sleeping. There were earthquakes. There were dead bodies. And so, your adrenaline and your trauma responses of even secondary trauma can help you work through those moments. But it's not like a years and years long solution where you never can take a break, right? And so it can be good. These can be good things because you're really in tune and you're really helping people in a time where it needs to be this fast-paced environment. But if you're, for example, a teacher and you're dealing with a lot of kids and there's a lot of, maybe you have a lot of IEPs in your classroom and it's a crowded classroom, and then they keep piling on new and new ways you have to report, and you have to report this way, or you could lose your job, or it could be a huge deal with a lawsuit. So, and then you're having to do more and more reports, and then all these emails come in, and curriculum changes and staff changes, and teachers have a high burnout rate anyway. And then suddenly your brain just stops doing what it can do. And you're like, what's happening to my brain, right? So have you seen those kind of things happen as well in certain work environments?
Yeah, absolutely. When we are not allowing our people to rest, or even if our employees and our team members do not have the skills to reset themselves, then we're going to see them continue to move down this stream of current of stress, and they will eventually get to burnout. One of the things that I'm actually researching right now are what are the skills and the factors that we can implement in the workplace to empower people to take stress in stride. That difference between, is it traumatic or is it just a life experience? How can we get people on the life experience track rather than on the trauma track? And one of the things that I'm seeing is that we assume people have the skills to recover from stresses, big or small. But not everyone has learned those skills. Not everyone has had that upbringing of, here's what you should do in the evenings to unwind and to reset and get yourself back in a good spot. And so some people just chronically live their lives in this trajectory toward burnout. And so some of the skills that we can be teaching our employees is how do we use breathing exercises? How do we use grounding strategies? How do we help ourselves recover? What are the mindsets that are going to keep us from dwelling on things that we can't change and focus on action items that we do have power over? So I'm pulling these things together. I really want to be able to develop a training that specifically targets this, because I see it as this huge lapse in education that is really going to make a huge difference to empower people to fully recover and not just assume that they're doing well while they're on this road to burnout.
Really helpful. I mean, here in Silicon Valley, it's very common to have people that just don't take any day off and they work well into the evenings. One of our recent guests on the podcast, Mita Malik, wrote a book called The Devil Emails at Midnight. There's a sequel coming out to The Devil Wears Prada. We all can't wait to see it. And you have this 996 trend here in Silicon Valley where it's working 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week, and a lot of competition with China and the AI race and all this kind of thing. And so it is so common to wear burnout as a badge of honor, but then the productivity goes down. People aren't making great decisions. They're certainly not doing any consensus-based decisions because they're making decisions very quickly, and they're not always the best decisions when you're working so fast and out of such a burnout and traumatic, response. And so, but you've spent quite a bit of time with, researching, and you have this survey, and it revealed insights about sort of this erosion of psychological safety in the workplace. What do you think was the most surprising or maybe counterintuitive finding from your research? And maybe what does that tell us about where organizations are getting it wrong?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I think one of the surprising things that I found, well, first and foremost, is that 80% of the people who took the survey had experienced workplace trauma. So just the shocking number that 80% of people had experienced workplace trauma. It was 56% that had said the words trauma, but when asked definitions of trauma and if they had experienced those things, 80% clicked those boxes that really demonstrated that they had experienced this. But one of the other things that we saw was that people would be more reactive to the normal or to the common workplace triggers, even if they did not feel like they were still experiencing trauma. And so the reactiveness to those triggers continues. That's something that persists. And again, when we're comparing was it trauma, was it a life lesson? Yeah, they had experienced something traumatic. They had overcome that trauma. Maybe they were in a life lesson kind of category now. But their life lesson was that triggers, like we need to talk, are still dangerous, right? Those indicators that maybe some people are like, oh, that's not that big of a deal. I don't even know why you would be stressed about that. Their life experience had said, no, when bosses do these things, that is kind of a red flag to psychological safety. That is something that we actually need to be worried by. And so it for me, it's really impactful that there are cues that leaders can give in the workplace that their workplace is psychologically safe. And there are cues that they can give that there is a lack of psychological safety in the workplace. But a lot of leaders are doing what they've been taught to do by their leaders. They're not considering the subtext of these actions and these behaviors. They're just culturally normalized. And so there is a need to shift away from these culturally normalized things that we do that are actually indicators that there is danger to the psychological safety in the workplace. There can be an erosion to that. And instead work on these tools that I've created that build psychological safety, which I looked at in my research as well. How do these impact your psychological safety? Do they increase or decrease? And for all of the tools, I have 9 tools that I recommend. More than 90% of people said that they would increase psychological safety in the workplace. So they're very powerful. Another thing that stood out to me as interesting was that a handful of people, 14, said that some of these would decrease psychological safety. And there was a space for longer answers, and many of those people had also experienced leaders using those tactics to do something underhanded. For example, they would say, well, do you feel like you're on board? Do you have any concerns about this plan? I really want to make sure that you feel heard as part of this conversation. They would speak up, they would share their true feelings, and then they would be fired and removed from the project. And so when leaders do things that look like good leader behaviors, they can't trust that because they've seen that done in a really sneaky and underhanded way. And so that goes back to what we were saying earlier about people having different triggers and you can't know what they are. And sometimes even trying to do the things that good leaders do can trigger people. And it's not because we as leaders are wrong or bad, it's because they've had really unfortunate experiences. And so that next question becomes, how can I ask this? How can I get your input and your wisdom and your insights and not make you feel triggered, reminding you of this previous experience? And again, it's a place for creative solutions to come out.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is there is this certain small percentage of the population that would be in this dark triad personality type. And if you've ever worked with anybody like that, and I have on a couple of occasions, unfortunately, it could be somebody with narcissistic personality disorder or, psychopathy or sociopathy. And so it's not the majority of the population, but occasionally those types of personality types will strategically manipulate words that should be safe in order to get people to perform or do something. And therefore that could cause a workplace trauma for somebody, not knowing if they're encountering a person like that again. Incidentally, we've been told in Silicon Valley, especially at the CEO level here, that the rates of those are quite high, where you're dealing with somebody who just has no empathy at all. And so their decisions, how they impact people's lives, it's just not a consideration at all. And where there's like a lot of tools being used to manipulate. And so it makes sense that people would feel that way if they've worked with somebody like that. And so if you are one of those people in the audience, I do hope you work with a therapist and also maybe an executive coach, because coming out of that environment myself years ago, I had to do some of that work to be able to trust again and to look for the signs and the red flags. And they're not always easy to spot. And sometimes you might be targeted by these individuals, especially if you're a very empathetic, successful leader. You often will be targeted, and it's not you. It's just that there's almost like a jealousy of who you are. And so that's why you get targeted. But I just want to say, keep being an empathetic and successful leader, because you don't want to change that. And at the same time, maybe learn the red flags and the signs. So if you start to see your boundaries being pushed or you're being manipulated with these words that should be safe, then you can recognize it, hopefully, before it's too late. But it's hard to see. It's designed for you not to see it. But yeah. So did you see some of that in the comments? Did that come up at all? Did you have that concern yourself when you read these 14 people and their differences there?
Oh, whether they were part of the dark triad leaders?
Whether they had been, working with somebody like that. Yeah.
Yeah, there are a lot of people who have communicated that, and we see that commonly. And whether it is because they're truly part of this dark triad, another thing that I have seen a lot of is people who are fearful, people who are also traumatized, who are trying to constantly watch their back and operating out of a fear mentality, are cutting down other people in order to get up ahead. And so it isn't necessarily a pathological issue so much as it is this fear response that they have learned over the course of their life. And one of the things that's really helpful, though, is when we recognize our leader might be in a fear situation themselves, is we can think about what are some of the strategies that we can use to let our leader know that they don't need to be afraid of us, that we actually are here to support them and to help them shine. And so I talk with a lot of my clients about managing up and what that looks like to empower your boss to be the best boss that they can be for you. And of course, there is certainly a line there between the people that we can have that influence over and the people who are really operating out of a different personality type. But being cognizant that trauma is not just impacting the people that report to us, but it is also impacting our peers, it's impacting our supervisors, and it's impacting ourselves. And when we have more of an understanding about how fear makes our actions land just sour, we can think about, what do we need to do to create safety in this situation so that people aren't reacting out of fear. And when people stop reacting out of fear and can start reacting out of a fullness of this is how I show up in the workplace, their actions are going to stop landing sour, and the personnel problems are going to dissipate, and the team culture is going to strengthen. And we're going to see that in our employee engagement and retention and productivity and the company profitability. Like, all of this really hugely impacts the bottom line. And I wish that people saw that more, how caring for the most important resource the company has well, and in accordance with recent scientific findings in the psychology field, it's actually better for your business than just trying to overwork them and let them run the road to burnout and try to replace them. We have better business strategies that we could be utilizing here.
It's just so wholeheartedly agree with that. And I think that unfortunately we're seeing in the U.S. some strong changes against human-centered leadership. I just believe it's bad for business. I just think that that's what the research shows, and it's what your research is showing. And when we've seen even, just large decisions that are impacting the lives of people, having to rearrange their lives to be able to work in certain situations, you start to have a high attrition, and it's usually the top talent that walks out the door. And often CEOs will sort of not want to kind of even measure that data because it's almost like a willful ignorance. It just is maybe too uncomfortable to face that. And maybe it's a lot of fear, and maybe it's their own personal, traumas, big T or little t or otherwise. But I think that when we can stay focused on the data, which does absolutely show that when we have more human-centered leadership approaches, leaders who listen to understand, leaders who are self-aware, leaders who have a strong learning agility and curiosity, and make decisions that impact people in a way that make them feel supported and psychologically safe, businesses thrive and grow, and leaders stay and they continue their careers in that same company and continue to keep building that tribal knowledge and growing the company. This has been such an incredible conversation. Thank you for sharing your research with us and just who you are as a person. How can people find you in more of your writing and more of what you're putting out in the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So in January of this year, I published Trauma-Informed Leadership, and so that book is available on Amazon. And then I also do coaching and consulting for leaders and companies to help them roll out these initiatives across their organizations. And so you can reach out at elizabethvaheysmith.com, and we can talk more about what you're needing in this season and how we can set you up for success.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Elizabeth. And I'm going to ask you another question for our Difference Makers community on Patreon. So if you guys haven't joined there, please go to patreon.com/aworldofdifference to hear that exclusive interview with Elizabeth. And thank you so much for joining us today from Vietnam. I really appreciate you and having this conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. This was wonderful.
Is something Elizabeth said maybe made you stop and think, ooh, that's me, or that's happening with my team and I didn't understand it until now? Well, you're not alone. And more importantly, you're not stuck. Trauma-informed leadership is the differentiator that separates good leaders from the ones that are just coasting and getting by. It's what allows you to build teams where people don't just perform, where you stay curious and help them heal and grow and actually want to show up. And in our globally mobile world where expats are constantly navigating loss and where TCKs are processing unresolved grief from a lifetime of goodbyes, and where every single one of us has been shaped by experiences we've never really fully processed, this isn't optional anymore. We keep going fast and moving forward, but sometimes it's important to slow down and be curious. And so here's what I want you to do. Share this episode. Share it with the leader who needs to understand why their team seem really checked out right now. Share it with your expat friend who's struggling after their third move in 5 years. And share it with the TCK in your life who needs to know their experience has a name and they're not broken. Share it with HR professionals, coaches, therapists, teachers, anyone who works with humans and who's, been through things. Tag Elizabeth Vahey Smith, tell her which moment resonated, and let her know you're committed to becoming a trauma-informed leader wherever you are in the world. Want more? Check the show notes for links to Elizabeth's books, The Practice of Processing and Trauma-Informed Leadership, information about TCK training and Unstacking Co., and for our Patreon supporters, an incredibly vulnerable, exclusive question where Elizabeth shares what her processing practice looks like when she's holding space for everyone else's trauma. If this conversation changed how you see leadership or how you see yourself, please leave us a review. Share it widely and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And remember, the best leaders aren't the ones who avoid trauma or pretend it doesn't exist or find the word just altogether annoying. They're the ones who acknowledge it, process it, create space for others to do the same. These hard conversations really matter as leaders, and you have everything you need to become that leader. This conversation is your starting point. Until next time, lead with awareness, create space for processing, slow down so that you can go fast, and never underestimate the power of psychological safety to build that trust on your team. This has been A World of Difference. Wherever you are in the world, whatever you're carrying, we're glad you're here. Find us on all podcast platforms. Join a global community of leaders who are doing the inner work to create outer impact. And wherever you are in the world, if you're celebrating the holidays soon, or if you're just taking in this time of year to be cozy in Denmark because it's cold and dark outside, or you're in the Southern Hemisphere and you're going to the beach all the time and listening to this podcast next to the waves on the shore, wherever you are, thank you for listening today. Thank you for sharing this episode with your friends. I know many of you do, and it makes me so happy because this community is truly outstanding about sharing great information with each other and helping each other make a difference wherever you are in the world. Keep making a difference wherever you are. Okay, difference makers, I know you, and I know when you hear something you really enjoyed and you learned from it, you want to share it. I am like that too, which is why I love to promote guests on this podcast for you to get to hear them yourself. Sometimes they write books, sometimes they write on Substack, sometimes they podcast, sometimes their voice is just every day in the workplace where they live and impact their communities in a variety of ways with all the hats that they wear. So if you enjoyed this episode, and I hope that you did, please share it with a friend, a parent, a neighbor, somebody you went to boarding school with back in the day, somebody at work, your boss, people on your team, because this is a message they needed to hear. And it have impacted you. Please give us a 5-star rating and give us a review. It really helps our reach for more people like you to find us, the difference makers, the listeners, the leaders, the people in your communities that are making the world a better place. I appreciate you so much. Has life ever thrown you a curveball? I've been thrown 1, 2, maybe 3. And okay, if we're being honest, a few more in life. And sometimes you just need a professional to talk with it about. And friends help and family helps, but having a professional therapist has been a game changer for me because of the skills they bring into those conversations. And I want you to have access to that too. So BetterHelp have been willing to give you 10% off your first month if you sign up today with www.betterhelp.com/difference. You deserve to have somebody walking through this with you. You deserve all the healing. And a professional is the kind of person that will not only listen, but they will give you tools to walk through this journey so that you are not alone. www.betterhelp.com/difference to get 10% off your first month today. Are you on Substack? Because I am, and I'd love to connect with you there. I process things there over Saturdays and Sundays, days off, sometimes weeknights as I'm researching and reading other articles. And it inspires me to write things where I'm going deeper into the behind the scenes of what some of the episodes on A World of Difference are all about. I'd love to connect with you there. So if you are on Substack, find me. You can go to loriadamsbrown.substack.com as a free, or I would prefer a paid subscriber, because then you get access to more of the in-depth things that are exclusively for my paid subscribers. I keep my prices as low as they can be on Substack, as low as they allow. But I do believe in being paid for my work, and I believe you should be paid for yours too. So join me there and let's make a difference together.